Coming up next.
It was just one of those things.
Take a trip down memory lane with a legend. Stage and screen star Kitty Carlisle Hart sings the songs from her extraordinary life upon the wicked stage.
Just one of those things when the things
and shares her stories of Broadway's giants. From Irving Berlin to Cole Porter, from Jerome Kern to George Gershwin, she knew them all. Join us for Kitty Carlisle Hart, My Broadway Memories. Funding for this program is provided by Roy R. Newberger and by the Ira and Leonore Gershwin Philanthropic Fund. Additional funding is provided by the members of 13. From birth, Kitty Carlisle was destined to be a Broadway baby her entire life. Though raised in Louisiana, she received music and theater training in Europe, which she put to good use in her 1933 Broadway debut as Prince Orlovsky in Champagne Sec. During her long Broadway career, she met and later married renowned playwright and director Moss Hart. Many generations would come to know her over the years through her many films, plays, and television appearances. After a long and extraordinary life in the arts, she would go on to play yet another important role for 20 years as chairman of the New York State Council on the Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, Kitty Carlisle Hart.
Some years ago, I was asked to speak in public about the American musical theater. Now, that's not something I normally did. As an actress, I was used to saying other people's lines. So I went to my husband, Moss Hart, and I said, what on earth would I talk about? And he said, well, you knew everyone in the American musical theater, and you knew most of them before you knew me. You knew Jerome Kern and Cole Porter and the Gershwins, and you know Dick Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein and Irving Berlin and George Kaufman and me, as well as Dietz and Schwartz and Leonard Bernstein, Comden and Green and Kurt Weill. My darling, I think you'll find that your friends are the American musical theater. So tonight I'm going to talk about them. And I think we'll get a panoramic view of a great deal of the history of the giants of the American musical theater. Broadway. For some, it's only a crowded street, but for the rest of us, it's a magical name to conjure with. It's where every night around 8 o'clock, the magic begins, where the corn is as high as an elephant's eye. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain. The cotton blossom docks, the jets and sharks confront each other. A phantom stalks. Fairy tales still transpire into the woods. And every night, something funny happens on the way to the Forum. There are no skyscrapers in those few square blocks we call the theater district, but there is an invisible monument there. A monument to a unique form of American culture, the modern musical theater. It was built show by show and song by song by many hands, by George M. Cohan and Irving Berlin, by Victor Herbert and Jerome Kern, by the Gershwin Brothers and Cole Porter, by Rodgers and Hart, by Rodgers and Hammerstein, by Kaufman and My Heart, and so many others. They were the architects, and they built the foundations. It started, of course, in New York City. The first genuine American musical was a show named The Black Crook, and it opened in Niblo's Gardens at the end of the Civil War. It was an extravaganza with broad appeal, fantastic stage effects, lavish ballets, huge casts, and lots of legs. Printed on the front of the playbill in large letters, it bragged that it cost $50,000 to put on, and in the end, it grossed $10 million. It derived from the Faust legend, a perennial subject for musical shows and opera. From Faust to damn Yankees, the devil, it seems, is always with us. Burlesque, minstrel shows, vaudeville, extravaganza, all of these forms had been bubbling and simmering. Burlesque was for the masses, vaudeville for the middle classes, and operetta, both foreign and homegrown, were for the upper crust. Gilbert and Sullivan, Strauss, Lehar, and Offenbach, imported from Europe, enjoyed great popularity along with our own émigrés. Victor Herbert, Frimmel, and Romberg. You know, Romberg had an encyclopedic memory for other people's tunes, which caused the wags to say, on the opening night of a Romberg show, you could whistle his new songs going into the theater as well as on the way out. From New Orleans came a truly American phenomenon, jazz. The great black artists all made magnificent contributions to the rise of American music. And the beginning of ragtime, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Scott Joplin, and U.B. Blake. Much of this popular music wound up in dazzling musical reviews under the particular genius of Florence Ziegfeld. The TV spectacular, like your show of shows and the old Carol Burnett shows, owe a great deal to Florence Ziegfeld's musical reviews. They had great comedians, beautiful girls, gorgeous costumes, and again, lots and lots of legs. You could dance to the beat of ragtime melodies coming from Tin Pan Alley. You know, I've discovered something. You all think, and so did I, that Tin Pan Alley was an idea, but it really was a place. It started with Charles B. Harris in Milwaukee when he wrote a song called After the Ball for his tailor, who was in amateur theatricals. The song made Harris a millionaire, and he hightailed it straight away to New York and 28th Street, where Tin Pan Alley was born. It was called Tin Pan Alley because of the cacophony created by the song pluggers and composers that came out of the buildings. Irving Berlin, the king of ragtime, and his generation of popular songwriters, including the Gershwins, were moving from Tin Pan Alley to Broadway shows. By the time Irving was 37 years old, he had composed so many hits, starting with Alexander's Ragtime Band in 1911, that when someone asked Jerome Kern, what do you consider Irving Berlin's place in American music? Kern said, Irving Berlin has no place in American music. He is American music. Musical comedy came sprawling into the world from the hands of Ned Harrigan and Tony Hart. The plots were either foolish or preposterous. Harrigan and Hart concoctions had a strong Irish flavor, and they got an exuberant welcome from the Irish community. Or if you preferred, you could sit back and enjoy a musical by the legendary George M. Cohan. More than 30 years before his starring role in Our Wilderness by Eugene O'Neill, Cohan, known as the Yankee Doodle Dandy, personified the American spirit of the turn of the century. In a country made by newcomers, in a city built by newcomers, on stages that gave unique opportunities to outsiders, the first wave of Jewish immigrants arrived in the late 1880s, and along came Weber and Fields with their special brand of humor. Many nations came singing onto the stages in New York City. We brought in all the ethnic elements of the melting pot and made them into a delicious, giant New York layer cake. Between World War I and the Depression, America was on the march. We were exploding with vitality, energy, and optimism. At least 70 theaters were in operation at the height of the boom. over 250 shows opened in a single season, of which 40 or 50 were musicals, playing to 20 million people. Doesn't that break your heart? The Depression in America and I arrived together in New York. I began to use the training my mother insisted upon to earn a living for both of us. It was my good fortune to arrive at a time when half the bill in a movie house was vaudeville. And from time to time, in some large theaters, instead of vaudeville, they presented a condensed version of an old Broadway musical. At that time, one hit song could make a career. But there was no hit song for me in my first show, Rio Rita. I waited 4 months for my next show, and it seemed an eternity. You know, when you're very young, time passes very slowly. But when you're older, it whizzes by. My mother once said, once you're past 50, every 15 minutes, it's breakfast. My next show was Champagne Sec, which was really Die Fledermaus, but other people had sung that score forever. I played Prince Orlovsky in black tights up to here. I had hoped for good notices on my singing, but following the great tradition of extravaganzas and Florence Ziegfeld, I got great notices on my legs. And I went straight to Hollywood. When I got to Hollywood, I did have a song in a movie with Bing Crosby that I thought might be my theme song. But unfortunately for me, it was picked up by a famous American violinist who used it as his theme song to get laughs. And it goes like this. Can it be the trees that fill the breeze with a rare and magic perfume? You know it isn't the trees, it's love in bloom. That was Jack Benny, of course, and it was written by Robin and Ranger, who were Hollywood writers. But many Broadway writers were going to Hollywood because the Depression made financial backing difficult to find for Broadway shows. Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, and the Gershwin Brothers went to Hollywood, and much later, Morse Hart followed the trek westward to write A Star is Born with Harold Arlen for Judy Garland, Hans Christian Andersen with Frank Lesser for Danny Kaye, and Gentleman's Agreement for Gregory Peck. When I met Jerome Kern, he was in Hollywood writing for Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. Kern was probably the father of the modern American musical, which he started at the charming but tiny Princess Theater. When I knew Kern, he had already written his classic Showboat with Oscar Hammerstein and many other hits. His last one was Roberta with Otto Harbach lyrics, which included that great song, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. One day I was asked to sing at a Hollywood party. I was very nervous because sometimes at a Hollywood party there might be a producer who would give me a part in his next movie. I wanted to sing Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, so I called Jerome Kern's daughter Betty. She was a great friend of mine, and I said to her, do you think your father would help me with the song? And she said, I'm sure he would. So indeed, one day I went over to their house, and I was sitting at the piano waiting for the great man, and I began to noodle around with the song, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and I changed one of the harmonies. Mr. Kern came in, glared at me over his spectacles, and he said, Kitty, I too have that F sharp on my piano, but I chose not to use it. Composers are very particular about the way their songs are sung. They don't like changes. But he came to the party and he played the song with me, and I'd like to sing it for you now. They asked me how I knew my true love was true. I, of course, replied, something here inside cannot be denied. They said someday you'll find all who love are blind. When your heart's on fire, you must realize smoke gets in your eyes. So I chaffed them and I gaily laughed to think they could doubt my love. Yet today my love has flown away. I am without my love. Now laughing friends deride tears I cannot hide. So I smile and say, when a lovely flame dies, smoke gets in your eyes. The big news in New York was the arrival of the Gershwin Brothers with Lady Be Good, with Fred Astaire and Adele Astaire. They were the jazz age, just as much as Scott Fitzgerald. People wanted rhythm and the Gershwins gave it to them. They wrote fascinating rhythm for Fred Astaire, and I've Got Rhythm for Ethel Merman. Lots of political satires were tickling Broadway audiences. The Gershwins and George Kaufman wrote a spoof of politics, Strike Up the Band, about a war with Switzerland, of all places, over the cheese tariff. They collaborated on another political satire called Of Thee I Sing. It was the first musical to receive a Pulitzer Prize. Everybody connected with the piece got a Pulitzer, except the composer, George Gershwin. And there was a song in it called Winter Green for President, sung by Victor Moore. I always loved the lyric. Winter green for president, winter green for president. He's the man the people choose, loves the Irish and the Jews. Then there was Pins and Needles, a review by Harold Rome, which was backed by the Ladies' Garment Workers Union. There were two sets of kids on either side of the stage, and the well-dressed ones sang to the ragamuffins. You're a red, you're a dirty red, and my mama says I shouldn't play with you. You're full of wrath, you never take a bath. You're a dirty red. And the ragamuffins sang to the well-dressed kids, bourgeoisie, dirty bourgeoisie, can't you see I wouldn't want to play with you? When people hiss you, you call the militia, dirty bourgeoisie. And don't forget I'd Rather Be Right, which portrayed Roosevelt, played by George M. Cohan, packing the Supreme Court. The play had music by Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart, and the book was written by George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart, no relation to Larry. I met George Gershwin because one day the telephone rang. The actor is always at the mercy of the telephone. The call was to do an all-Gershwin radio show. George was going to be playing his concerto, and I was to sing 2 Gershwin songs with George accompanying me. Now, Rudy Valley was leading the orchestra, and Rudy couldn't read music, and the concerto had quite a few tempo changes. When he opened up the score, it was like an accordion. Every time there was a change of tempo, Rudy had a different color paper. It did the trick. When the mellow moon begins to beam Every night I dream a little dream, and of course Prince Charming is the theme, the he for me. Although I realize as well as you, it is seldom that a dream comes true. To me it's clear that he'll appear. Someday he'll come along, the man I love, and he'll be big and strong, the man I love. And when he comes my way, I'll do my best to make him stay. He'll look at me and smile, I'll understand, and in a little while he'll take my hand. And though it seems absurd, I know we both won't say a word. Maybe I shall meet him Sunday, maybe Monday, maybe not. Still I'm sure to meet him one day. Maybe Tuesday will be my good news day. He'll build a little home just meant for two, from which I'll never roam. Would you? And so all else above, I'm waiting for the man I love. Okay. I was terribly excited meeting George Gershwin because, of course, I knew all about him. He was one of the most fascinating and brilliant bachelors around town. He seemed to have everything, yet there was something vulnerable about him. Why, I don't know. He was successful, good-looking, yet he constantly needed approval, and you felt it. His enthusiasm was part of his charm, too. He was terribly boyish for a man who was that successful. He had an enormous sense of joie de vivre, which he infused into everything he did. Women adored him, and he returned the compliment. George had a little waltz that he would compose on the spot for whatever young lady took his fancy at a party. He would lead her to the piano bench, and then and there he would be inspired to write this waltz just for her. The lyric had a blank space in it to fill in the name of the lady, any lady. I used to think of it as his mating call. After we became friends, he once told me he'd gone to visit Maurice Ravel, the famous French composer, with an eye to studying with him. He was a serious music student, George. He had studied with Schillinger, a famous teacher and proponent of the 12-tone scale. Now, Ravel was struck by the youth of young George Gershwin, and he worried about how much money it had cost him to get to Paris, and could he afford to stay and study. So he said, "Mr. Gershwin, how much money do you make from your Broadway shows?" And George said, "Well, about $1,000 a week." And Ravel gasped, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Gershwin, may I study with you?" When I knew him, George Gershwin was finishing his opera, Porgy and Bess, which elevated American music to new heights. He used to ask me to come up to his apartment and help him by singing Summertime while he presumably fiddled with the orchestration. But the next time he asked me to come up to his apartment while he fiddled with the orchestration, I caught on. This was a ploy he used, the way other men used to say, Come on up to my apartment and see my etchings.
I'm not alone. As long as I find you in every dream.
I was in a movie with some knockabout comics, A Night at the Opera with the Marx Brothers.
And in those magic moments, I'll have you for my own.
Little did I know that a great part of my life would begin when I was on the set one day, and George Kaufman, who had written the movie, came over to me and he said, "There are two friends of mine here from New York, and they're looking for a leading lady for their new musical called Jubilee. And their names are Moss Hart and Cole Porter." Well, Moss Hart had already written Face the Music and His Thousands Cheer with Irving Berlin, and I had sung many Cole Porter songs. One of them changed my understanding of the form that popular music was taking. Up to then, we'd been singing, "I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air." But one day, when I was a very young girl living in Europe, I was sitting on my balcony in a summer resort. And across the way, there came wafting a song from a gramophone with a beat I had never heard before. What is this thing called love? This funny thing called love. Just who can solve its mystery? Why should it make a fool of me? Jubilee was written 60 years ago, and it was about the British royal family who didn't want to be royals anymore. The Queen wanted to take swimming lessons from Johnny Weissmuller, the great Tarzan. The King wanted to be a prestidigitator. He had a rope trick he wanted to perfect. And the princess, whose name prophetically was Diana, wanted to marry a famous nightclub entertainer. And the young prince only wanted to go to New York and see the sights. Moss and Cole asked me if I'd come up to the suite and listen to the score, and Moss would read the book. It was just one of those things, just one of those crazy flings, one of those bells that now and then rings, just one of those things. It was just one of those nights, just one of those fabulous flights, a trip to the moon on gossamer wings, just one of those things. If we thought a bit of the end of it when we started painting the town, we'd have been aware that our love affair was too hot not to cool down. So goodbye, dear, and amen. Here's hoping we'll meet now and then. It was great fun, but it was just one of those things. I tell you, I didn't get the job, but many, many years later, I got the man. Cole Porter was one of the adornments of the American musical theater, but his background was quite different from the others, who were all New Yorkers. Cole was born in Peru, Indiana, and his family was rich and social, and he went to Yale, where he wrote the college fight song, "Bulldog, Bulldog, Bow Wow Wow, Bulldog, Bulldog, Eli Yale." He then went on to write very sophisticated songs like I Get a Kick Out of You from Anything Goes in 1934. Not only were his lyrics sophisticated, some of them were even considered scandalous. I get no kick from champagne. And the second verse was, I get no kick from cocaine. It didn't sit well with the censors in the 1930s. And one of his songs was completely banned from the radio because it took a very sympathetic view of a poor girl who was a prostitute. The song was called Love for Sale. Moss and he were very good friends, but Moss was from a totally different background. He was a poor boy from the Bronx, and he always said he went to a college that he made up called Hebrew Tech. The theater breaks down more prejudice than almost anything else. The fun that Moss had examining the royal family not wanting to be royals perhaps led him to think about people who didn't want to be what they were or who didn't like what they were. Freud had come into the language, and Moss wrote the first theater piece about a subject that had never been seriously touched upon either in the movies or on the stage. It explored the mysteries of psychoanalysis, and he was the first person to bring psychoanalysis to the stage. The play was Lady in the Dark, and it took Broadway by storm, and swept along with it Danny Kaye and Gertrude Lawrence. Moss asked Kurt Weill, who came to New York at the beginning of World War II as a refugee from Hitler's Germany, to write the music, and Ira Gershwin to write the lyrics. When a play runs a very long time, like Lady in the Dark, stars take a vacation. Moss again asked me to audition because Gertrude Lawrence needed a vacation. I really didn't want to replace her. She was incomparable. But I wanted to see Moss Hart again, so I went along and I sang My Ship. My ship has sails that are made of silk. Its decks are trimmed with gold. And of jam and spice there's a paradise in the hold. My ship's aglow with 1,000,000 pearls, and rubies fill each bin. The sun sits high in a sapphire sky when my ship comes in. I can wait the years till it appears one fine day, one spring. But the pearls and such, they won't mean much if there's missing just one thing. I do not care if that day arrives, that dream need never be. If the ship I sing doesn't also bring my own true love to me, if the ship I sing doesn't also bring my own true love to me. One night I was at Lillian Hellman's house. By the way, Lillian has her place in the American musical theater. Not only did she write plays such as Little Foxes and The Children's Hour, but years later she wrote the book for the musical Candide. During the course of the evening at Lillian's, I was sitting on the sofa, and Moss was sitting on the sofa next to me. Now, I knew he'd been to the South Pacific during World War II with his play, The Man Who Came to Dinner, to entertain the troops. So, of course, I looked up at him and I said, Moss, tell me about your trip to the South Pacific. And we were married 8 months later. I finally made a marriage suitable enough even for my mother. A new era was beginning that led to that great watershed of American musical theater, Oklahoma. For almost a decade, the American musical was reshaped by Rodgers and Hammerstein. In effect, Rodgers and Hammerstein opened the floodgates. Richard Rodgers' first song was called Campfire Days. Summer camp was a fertile ground for young composers. Arthur Schwartz wrote one of his first songs when he was at summer camp, and it goes like this. I love to lie awake in bed, and after taps, I pull the flaps above my head and let the stars shine on my pillow. Oh, what a light the moonbeam shed. And when Arthur was writing with Howard Dietz some years later, that turned into, I guess I'll have to change my plan. I never dreamed that there would be another man. I overlooked that point completely before the big affair began. Dick Rodgers' older brother was an undergraduate at Columbia University, and even before Dick went to Columbia, he hung around with other students like Oscar Hammerstein, Herman Mankiewicz, Howard Dietz, and Lorenz Hart, with whom he began to work. Rodgers and Hart explored new pathways. They collaborated with novelist John O'Hara to make a hard-bitten musical about a real healer, Pal Joey. They also collaborated on Your Toes, which was the first modern musical to use ballet, choreographed by none other than George Balanchine. This show was directed and partly written by George Abbott, who lived to be 107. He also directed me in a revival of On Your Toes when he was only 95. Other explorations into ballet in the American musical came with Agnes de Mille and Jerome Robbins. In the musical theater, finding the right collaborator is as difficult as finding the right marriage partner. Oscar Hammerstein had just finished working with the only collaborator he never had an argument with, a dead one. His composer for Carmen Jones was George Bizet. He died in 1875, 20 years before Oscar was born. When Lorenz Hart became too ill to work, Richard Rodgers needed to find a new partner, and there was Oscar Hammerstein, who needed one too. I sang at many parties with Dick playing the piano. He would always say, "What should we sing?" And I would always say, first, something wonderful from The King and I. This is a man who thinks with his heart. His heart is not always wise. This is a man who stumbles and falls, but this is a man who tries. This is a man you'll forgive and help and protect as long as you live. He will not always say what you would have him say, but now and then he'll say something wonderful. The thoughtless things he'll do will hurt and worry you. Then all at once he'll do something wonderful. He has 1,000 dreams that won't come true. You know that he believes in them, and that's enough for you. You'll always go along, defend him when he's wrong, and tell him when he's strong. He's wonderful. He'll always need your love. one who needs your love can be wonderful. The 1950s were called the extended season because over the decade there were an extraordinary number of hit shows. It began with Frank Lesser and that most New Yorkish story, Guys and Dolls. Lerner and Lowe took us to far-off places like Camelot, and Chodoroff and Fields and Comden and Green and Leonard Bernstein brought the Brazilian Navy to Roz Russell in Wonderful Town. At the end of the 1950s, Rodgers and Hammerstein gave us the sound of music. It was in the middle of that decade that Americans witnessed what is surely one of the greatest musicals, My Fair Lady, written by Lerner and Lowe and directed by Moss Hart. I must tell you that when I did Fledermaus many, many years ago on Broadway, there was a young pianist who played in the pit of the Morosco Theater, and he would come up the stairs every evening to my dressing room, and he would stand behind me while I made up, and he was Austrian, and he had quite an accent, and he would say, "Someday I am going to write the best musical on Broadway." And I would wonder how many pianists are saying that same thing in the 40 or 50 so musicals playing all over Broadway. And now, lap dissolve, as they say in the movies, to opening night of My Fair Lady. Alan J. Lerner, who wrote the book and the lyrics, and Moss, who directed My Fair Lady, were pacing up and down as they always did on an opening night. And I was standing against the back wall, and the little pianist from the orchestra, who was now an old friend of mine, because it was 35 years later, came over to me and he whispered in my ear, and he said, "Well," he said, "I wrote the best musical on Broadway." And it was the composer, Frederick Lowe. In the 60s, the country was changing, and Broadway was reflecting it. As the social and political rebellion began in the 1960s, so too was there a rebellion against the old forms. Rock and roll finally made it to the Great White Way, along with nude scenes and four-letter words, and of course, long hair. Despite rock and roll, we could still enjoy Hello, Dolly by Jerry Herman, Funny Girl by Julie Stein, and Fiddler on the Roof by Bach and Harnick. It was well into the 1970s when we saw Chorus Line and then Annie, and of course, Grease. Since then, we've had the British invasion. But one composer-lyricist manned the ramparts for American music, Stephen Sondheim. His story is as close as any to the modern American theater, with shows such as Follies, A Little Night Music, Sunday in the Park with George, Company, and a dozen others. And here's a song he wrote, From Merrily We Roll Along, based on a play by Kaufman and Hart. Not a day goes by, not a single day, you're not somewhere a part of my life, and I need you to stay as the days go by. I keep thinking, where does it end? That it can't get much better, much longer. But it only gets better and stronger and deeper and nearer and simpler and freer and richer and clearer. And no, not a day goes by. pretty. So what Kaufman and Hart called the theater the fabulous invalid is by no means dead. First of all, the American musical has become an American cultural institution. I think that musicals thrive on Broadway not only because of their artistry, but also because Broadway is, in effect, the American story. Irving Berlin was in at the beginning of the American musical theater, so it's only fitting that I invoke him at the end. Irving Berlin always seemed to have a private line into the heart of the American public. Morse did 3 shows with Irving, and we were family friends. One day, as a birthday present, he sent me the sheet music of a song written in 1917, which goes like this. Smile and show your dimple, you'll find it's very simple. And that turned into Easter Parade. Mrs. Berlin was a very distinguished writer in her own right. She contributed to The New Yorker before she was married, and she wrote brilliant novels about her family. She was my daughter Kathy's godmother. She once told me an absolutely charming story about 2 of Irving's songs. You know that when Mrs. Berlin, then Ellen Mackey, wanted to marry Irving Berlin, it was like the Montagues and the Capulets. Clarence Mackey, the head of Postal Telegraph, who was Ellen's father, refused to allow her to see this young composer. Now, one day, the Mackeys were giving the great ball of the season at their house called Harbor Hill on Long Island for the then Prince of Wales, and everybody was there. Mr. Mackey had many treasures in this great house, but the thing he cared most about were his men in armor. He had the whole ground floor of this huge pile filled with men in armor. Now, Ellen Mackey is dancing around with the Prince of Wales, and she says, "Sir, do you mind if I go upstairs and telephone my beau?" And the Prince of Wales says, "Not at all, Miss Mackey. If you'll promise me, your father won't show me his men in armor again." So she went upstairs and she called Irving, and this is what he played for her. All alone, I'm so all alone, there is no one else but you. All alone by the telephone, waiting for a ring, a ting-a-ling. I'm all alone in the evening, all alone, feeling blue, wondering where you are and how you are, and if you are all alone too. And they ran away and got married, and he gave her this song. I'll be loving you always, with a love that's true always. When the thing you planned need a helping hand, I will understand always, always. Days may not be fair always, that's when I'll be there always. Not for just an hour, not for just a day, not for just a year, but always. Now, you know what would be wonderful? If you'd all sing it with me. It would sound so great. I'll be loving you always, with a love that's true always. When the things you planned need a helping hand, I will understand always, always. Days may not be fair always, that's when I'll be there always. for just a day, not for just a year, but always. Thank you. Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you. The performing arts are transitory, but in the musical theater they are recreated and revived constantly. I've been fortunate in my life to be part of this rich history, and this song by Kurt Weill and Maxwell Anderson sums up my feelings, the September Song. When you meet with the young men early in spring, they court you in song and rhyme. They woo you with words and a clover ring. But if you examine the goods they bring, they have little to offer but the songs they sing, and a plentiful waste of time of day, a plentiful waste of time. Oh, it's a long, long while from May to December, and the days grow short when you reach September, when the autumn weather turns the leaves to flame. One hasn't got time for the waiting game. Oh, the days dwindle down to a vintage brew. September, November, and these few vintage years I'd spend with you. These vintage years I'd spend with you. Oh, the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November, and these few precious days I'd spend with you. These precious days I'd spend with you. The arts may sometimes seem of no more consequence than the whirring of a cricket in the grass, but the arts do live continuously, and they live literally by faith. They outlive governments and creeds and societies, even the very civilizations that produce them. They cannot be destroyed altogether, because they represent the substance of faith, the only creativity. They are what we find again when the ruins are cleared away. Catherine Ann Porter.